Yeah, good day, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. Myself and the presenters, or the presenter, had a little bit of a technical issue. So if you may need to dial in if you're having trouble hearing this. So you can do that at the top in the middle, on the left-hand side of that uh, toolbar up there. You can change your audio settings and change it to dial in only, and it'll dial you in. And you'll be able to hear everything that's being said. But without further ado, thank you very much for joining us for this webinar presentation. My name is John Clements. I'm the technical lead for the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC, one of three IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, or DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. HDIAC serves as one of the premier information research partners and curators of technology advancements and trends for the Homeland Defense and Homeland Security communities. As such, our organization supports those working in the Homeland Defense and Security domain of DoD research and engineering. Do this by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. We provide research and analysis services to help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We hope you enjoy this webinar and that it serves as a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD Homeland Defense and Security research. So before we begin, I'll note a couple of administrative items. First, if you're dialed in by phone and would like a copy of the slides, they were recently posted to the HDIAC webinar announcement. You can go to hdIAC.org/webinars and find today's webinar presentation. When you click on it at the bottom of the announcement, it'll say to view the webinar PDF, click here. You can click there to download the PDF. Secondly, all participants are muted, but feel free to chat using the attendee chat button on the left-hand side of the webinar screen. You can chat with each other, and I will be monitoring that chat as well. However, if you would like to pose a question for the Q&A session at the end, I ask that you please try to use the audience question tool at the top center of your screen. It is the icon that looks kind of like a chat bubble next to the file folder. At the end of the presentation, I'll go over the Q&A, and for the benefit of those on the phone, I will be reading the questions out loud to the presenter. Just another note on that as well, our presenter, Dr. Gavin, is going to ask a couple of questions, and she's asking, since we don't have a method of live answering by verbally, she's asking that some of the that you answer in the chat. So there might be a little bit of a pause while she's waiting to see responses in the chat to some of the questions. So it's trying to make it a little more collaborative than some of the other webinars that we do. If you have a technical issue during the presentation, have no fear. Full presentation will be available online. You can check back on the HDIAC website. Once the webinar is posted, the Go to Webinar button that originally took you to the Any Meeting registration form will then take you to the YouTube link for this presentation. So now with all that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our presenter. So today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Cynthia Gavin. Dr. Gavin is a strategist with a diverse background in healthcare, chemical, biological, radiological disaster response, and U.S. military planning. She has provided strategic advisement for the U.S. Army, U.S. Secret Services Technical Security Division, and the City of New York Office of Emergency Management and Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, and has a passion for developing a partnership with her clients to co-create strategic initiatives. She holds a Doctor of Strategic Leadership from Regent University School of Business and Leadership, a Master of Science in Planning, Policy, and Administration from UMBC Emergency Health Services Department, and a Bachelor of Science in Emergency Health Sciences also from UMBC. She has taught for the Harvard School of Public Health and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and published several works within the Defense Department and the private sector, including her recent book, NEXTGEN Leadership for Managing Disasters, Creating a Future-Oriented Model for State and Local Officials. So with that, Dr. Gavin, you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much, John, and I welcome everybody who's joined us here today. I'm very happy to be here presenting and sharing information, but I would like to make this as interactive as possible. So please go ahead, use the chat feature as John described. You don't have to wait till the end to make comments or ask questions, and that way we're really going to get into it today. So as we kick off, let me provide everyone today's focus. Certainly the theme is defense support to civil authorities, a next-gen perspective. And what I propose we are to get out of today's discussion is to consider our future role in DISCA, one based on a vision of success. Yet to achieve that, we're going to need to talk about one of our most basic and foundational planning assumptions, and that is that every disaster is a local disaster. Do we still believe this is an effective planning assumption? And more specifically, when it comes to DISCA, is this helpful when it comes to DoD's interaction with civilian counterparts who often have the least amount of experience in disaster management? I'm bringing this up because all of us have now lived through the COVID-19 pandemic. How well did things work for you? How well did a disaster being managed at the local level work for you? Did it impact you, your family, your organization, or your ability to provide your professional role in DISCA? I'd love to hear a couple of basic responses, so please throw them into the chat for me. John, it looks like there's a couple of folks who are responding. Did things go well for folks or not during the COVID-19? A couple people saying things did well from Anne Arundel County, things kind of worked out. Of course, it sounds like most of you might be emergency workers yourselves. Let's see. Message from a few other folks. So I'm getting a couple of mixed responses, right? Certainly some people felt like things did not go well. There was a shortage of toilet paper and food and so forth. Some people didn't get to go to church or organizations. Their businesses were shut down. I'm also reading that some folks had big differences about how things were applied in different areas, right? In Florida, things went well in some cases. I love that. In other cases, things were kind of ignored. Right, right. Yeah, in the end, we've done a pretty good job distributing those vaccines. So that's kind of a good news story. So you know, I love these responses. Too much redundancy. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. A lot of questions that went on. Civilian affairs, right, that was kind of difficult. We here in the DoD, it took us a little while to like figure out how exactly to support our civilian counterparts. Some places just did really well. Other places were not as good identifying their needs or were slow to identify their needs. So let's just kind of keep those things in mind as we progress and we challenge this basic assumption. We need mandates. Interesting about the vaccine. Got it. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, but you folks can go ahead and keep adding your responses there. I love it. PPE stockpiles not available, correct? So in the military, I know that we love our bottom line upfront statement. So here it is. This is what we're going to focus on today as a group, folks. Disaster leadership practice. It's something few leaders possess, and yet key followers and citizens expect their officials to possess it. What do I mean by a disaster leadership practice? Well, it means a leader who deliberately takes action, possesses specific skill sets, and has experience creating clarity and unity during a disaster event. It is something followers expect those within every organization to employ, even if you're a non-emergency oriented team, organization, or community. We're going to focus on that. We'll also look a little bit at our historical timeline, and then we're going to hone in on an analysis of driving and constraining forces. My findings suggest that we are on the brink of change. In the 21st century, we will experience different types of disasters, and how disasters will unfold will also be different. This means we will require an enhanced disaster response model, one that uses system dynamics to align emergency and non-emergency stakeholders more routinely. And that means how we engage as DoD will be different. There are certainly strategic implications associated with future disasters, but let me just put it out there for my business friends. In business terms, disasters are disruptors, which means they require change agent leaders. No longer will it be acceptable for our mayors, governors, and CEOs to simply declare a disaster and hand everything off to police and fire or the emergency manager. And what's particularly interesting is that we in the DoD spend a lot of time cultivating leadership, but are we cultivating the right kind of leaders that can help our civilian counterparts during a DISCA mission? Better yet, have we even ever considered that our leadership is an offering to lend to our civilian counterparts? And before we end today, we are going to get into a bit of a discussion about the future role when providing DISCA, meaning can DoD have its own vision of success even when we're connected to local authorities that may not have a vision of success? All right, so that's the big nuggets of where we're going today. Someone up there is asking, what is DISCA? DISCA is Defense Support to Civil Authorities, okay? Defense Support to Civil Authorities. So in 2019, I published a book called Next Generation Leadership for Managing Disasters. The book focused on providing all state and local officials a leadership practice, as it was apparent many leaders had no idea what their role and responsibilities were during a disaster. Perhaps this is because we have routinely employed the certified emergency manager, which is a good news story, but now officials no longer think there's a role for them other than declaring the disaster. Additionally, when conducting research, I started to notice a few things. Did you know that since the 1950s, state-declared disasters have risen each decade from 94 to 853 every decade? Terrorist incidents have risen each decade from 8 to 75, and mass fatality-related shootings have risen each decade from 0 to 26. So if you thought that there's a lot more disasters going on out there, there are. What's interesting is that in 2011, FEMA did some futuring, and they published their predicted future disasters. Of course, the floods, droughts, fires, mudslides, earthquakes were all in there. Those are kind of our natural disasters. We get accustomed to those things. But in addition to that, they went ahead and identified the critical infrastructure failure, border runs and infiltration, domestic and transnational terrorism, mass fatality shootings and riots, civil unrest, cybercrime that results in death, sea burning and new pandemics, and international disasters. If they ever got that last list right, they did this time around. But why does it seem, even if it is a bit subjective, that some disasters, like the 2015 Freddie Gray incident, don't go as well as other disasters such as the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing? Could it be what we call a disaster is so much different, or what we prepare for is so much different? Like, certainly, again, we have a lot of experience with these hurricanes and flooding and wildland fires. And since every disaster is a federal disaster, do we in the Department of Defense need to wait for our civilian counterparts to lead the way, even though many of these officials have the least amount of experience or ability to bring about success? Right? It's a question I'm posing for us to think through. So as we jump into our topic, let's do a little backcasting and consider how our history has shaped our thinking. In this diagram, you will see the FEMA model of prevent, protect, respond, recover, and mitigate. It should look very familiar to you. It's a linear model. It's intended to move us from an initial state to the end of the disaster. But did you know that this construct basically came about in the late 1970s when airline crashes and airline terrorism was at its highest? According to the Aviation Safety Network, 1972 was the worst year on record for the aviation industry. 2,400 people lost their lives that year in 72 incidents. And so much of what we've created as our part of our DISCA response takes this linear model into account. And yet in 2017, that same Aviation Safety Network declared it the safest year in history of commercial airline travel, with only 59 people having perished in 14 accidents worldwide. That's a significant improvement due to the industry focusing on flight safety. Nevertheless, we have continued to use this model, and in 1999, when the non-lugar diminish legislation came out, and to help 120 cities in America prepare for weapons of mass destruction, we started to make some additional improvements to the model, right? For example, we now conduct disaster planning. Everybody knows about TTXs and FTXs and facilitated discussions. We know how to use our emergency operations centers better. We know how to write after action reports, and we even know how to do improvement action plans based on those AARs. But essentially, we are using that same linear disaster model. And what I propose to you today is that this model, which initially helped us understand disaster mitigation, might now be the very thing that's creating blind spots in our thinking and response. Thus, what we believe is possible is based on the mental constructs we create. And certainly during our COVID-19 experience, all of us could tell something wasn't working quite like it was supposed to. So here's a timeline of what shaped our traditional emergency management model. Although one of the most catastrophic disasters in the US was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and of course we all experienced the 1918 Spanish flu that killed 675,000 people in America in just a matter of months, it wasn't until 1953 when we started to gather data on disasters. And it wasn't until 1961 that Fritz defined what a disaster was. He stated, it's an event concentrated in time and space in which a society or a relative self-sufficient subdivision of the society undergoes severe danger and incurs losses to its people, physical environment, and its social structure, so that the fulfillment of all or some of these essential functions is prevented. All right. 20 years later, after FEMA became an official agency, the International Association of Emergency Managers solidified their association by requiring a certified emergency management degree. And then, of course, all of us were around in 2002 when the Department of Homeland Security started following, we all know, September 11th, right? But it was in 2013 that something started to shift when the Boston Marathon bombing occurred. And some call it an illustration of what a good response looks like. Did you know that people have talked more positively about this disaster than any other? And in a strange way, the response embodied the spirit of the people of Flight 93, the plane that crashed into Somerset, Pennsylvania in 2001. The Boston bombing incident showed individuals coming together without a plan. And it was Marcus et al. In 2014 who called it beneficial swarming, which was based on swarm intelligence theory. So although swarm intelligence theory was not new, the idea of applying it to disaster management was. The theory had been around since 1989, and it continues to be applied to next generation artificial intelligence. But what Marcus observed was that complex outcomes were often derived from the actions of simple individuals, even when no single entity was in charge. Citizens or individuals were still able to make decisions that benefited the whole, such decisions such as the ability to follow social cues, the ability to adhere to simple rules, to allocate or divide labor even in a dynamic situation, and to effectively evaluate input or make decisions when given options. The only downside has been that the violation of one rule has the ability to collapse what is called beneficial swarming. With that in mind, then, this statement becomes all the more profound. What leaders and citizens believe about disasters will drive outcomes. Beliefs, true or false, about capability, vulnerability, resource limitations, and resiliency will drive when they act, what they decide, and the strategy they expect others to employ when working towards stated goals. What is interesting to realize is that our local and state leaders often possess the least amount of disaster experience leading and making decisions or aligning resources under these kinds of conditions. Therefore, this statement about what we believe will take over the response regardless of the numerous assets that exist within the U.S. or within the Department of Defense. What do I mean? Well, during the initial outbreak of Ebola in 2014, did you know many governors did not believe it was safe to transport cremains of Ebola decedents? Despite this erroneous belief, these decisions very directly impacted hospitals, families, the business industry, and to include DoD's plan to repatriate our fallen if we had any, and thankfully we didn't. Specific to COVID-19, many of us suffered the impact of overly constrained decision-making at the local level when officials told us which businesses were essential and non-essential. Personally, I would argue if you're a business and people want to conduct business with you, then by default you are essential. But I think you get my point. All these things are indicating it's time to modify our 1970 disaster response model. Oops. Hang on a second, folks. There's a little delay in the computer slide progress. But as always, there's driving and resisting forces when it comes to change. And depending on the strength and influence of some of those variables, we in DoD can either be on the creating side of our future or on the responding side of our future. So let's look at a few things about those driving forces. Having conducted a force field analysis, here are some of the results, all right? Some of them we've talked about when it comes to prompting change. We started to talk about what constituted disaster has changed. There has been a definite increase in the number of disaster declarations. But in addition to that, there are significant population shifts. And with those shifts of age, size, backgrounds, history, so forth, that results in increased vulnerability, difficulty communicating with folks. We know that we have much more constrained budgets today and federal assets, and then of course there's an increase in terrorism threats. So those are all the things prompting changes, but Resisting change, well, albeit stagnant, we have a response framework that we know. People love what they know and don't always want to change what they know. Local and state plans that have reduced officials down to a declaration, they might say, hey, Cynthia, leave it alone. We're working pretty good here. I don't think we want to change the mayor's role in this anymore. Other resistance to change is that disasters, as we're seeing, could be highly politicized for personal gain. And then this last one I find so intriguing that it happens every single time, right? There's an intentional expectation mismatch that always gets discussed between the federal government and the state government, between their roles and responsibilities, as if we don't understand constitutionally that there is a separation of powers here. And yet this whole thing goes on, and a lot of people give me the impression that they don't want that necessarily to go away. Nevertheless, with all these driving forces, we must ask ourselves, what is it that we want? In DoD, what is it we want? And I think it's to be relied on less, since we have a primary mission to defend our nation. But how do we prepare for the unexpected, right? This is a big challenge for us. And no one knows more than DoD that no plan survives the first few military actions. Things are far too dynamic and volatile. But there are a few things we do know, things that we need to avoid, like bounded awareness. The U.S.'s current disaster management framework, which has existed since 1979, it once helped leaders understand the breadth and scope and complexity of disasters. But now I'm thinking it's creating a bounded awareness, meaning an arbitrary and dysfunctional bounding of a problem, leaving leaders with an inability to recognize relevant information when it counts. And knowing this, at the very least, our future disaster response model needs to take into account two things. First, it must help us avoid bounded awareness that a linear model always results in. Second, we must have a model that is as dynamic as the disaster itself. But people always come to me and say, hey, Gavin, you're making it too complicated. I had a boss who always said, can you make it simpler? Please make it simpler. Well, the way you make it simpler is to set the conditions for success, and that is to have a vision of success. Did you know that since 1961, we have been operating in our industry without a vision of success in disaster management? And without a vision, we have no direction. All our goals and objectives languish. This is basic leadership theory. So if we go back to that Boston bombing incident, we consider what led to beneficial swarming. For several years, the community had been fostering 7 specific things. They had a whole of community preparation. Now, that's probably pretty easy for them because they've had the Boston Marathon going on for the last 100 years, but they took it seriously every single time. They had strong leadership presence, so when the mayor became one of the victims and was hospitalized, the governor stepped in right away. They had long-standing partnerships within law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions that worked together routinely, and there was a very strong public-private headship that was going on. The thing that was new that happened during that particular bombing was what they called community followership. Many citizens and runners followed the actions of what I call ad hoc leaders from the emergency responders. So when the emergency responders scooped and ran with victims, they actually said out loud, later on, they go, hey, I can do it, and I'm in it. And then at some point in time, because they were doing it and other citizens saw what they were doing, there was this transition period, a mindset shift where the people started to say, we can do it, and we're in it. So if we have a vision of success, then everything starts to fall in place. Now consider for the COVID-19 pandemic, we didn't have this. What we had was a federal strategy to slow the spread. And this was a terrific strategy. It gave leaders time to figure out how to align limited resources. Specifically, it helped the government and the private sector with manufacturing and delivering resources. Yet, technically, we did not have a vision of success. Why do we refrain from having one? Are we so concerned that to declare a vision would come across as insensitive when so many people have lost their lives, their business, or property? Perhaps. But in leadership terms, we need to do this if for no other reason than a vision puts us on the right trajectory when there are volatile, complex, ambiguous, and uncertain situations ahead. And here is one version of a vision statement. Certainly every community should create their own. We will always survive the disaster. We will never grow weary of caring for our fellow citizens. Together we will strive to avoid what knowingly will devolve our sense of unity as we conduct our respective missions. As individuals, we will choose to act as a collective, knowing we must endure past this incident, and in the end, we will become more cognizant of our humanity, our need for each other, and we will more deeply value the gift of human life, which sometimes can only be realized when we experience tragedy together as a community. In addition to a vision, we need a complementary practice. Instead of just surviving or getting back to normal or creating a new normal, which can come about based on some opportunistic motives, we need to create a complementary practice that leverages the effective aspects we have built into our disaster response model, but do so in a way that does not result in bounded awareness. And this approach needs to be for both emergency and non-emergency oriented entities, and it must incorporate DoD's strengths. So let's go through each of these conditions so you can see what I mean. All right, most of us know about preparedness, and in the military, we call this readiness. And in terms of DISCA, we have traditionally focused on threat assessments, vulnerability assessments, and again, attempt to understand the breadth and scope of a river flooding or a wildland fire. But what I'm suggesting to you is that we broaden the idea from preparedness to a condition of pre-disaster. And then we implement network leadership, which focuses on developing concepts with stakeholders by identifying desired outcomes instead of establishing a stated goal or objective. So for example, the desired outcome could be prevention, could be protection or resilience, or it could be all three. And when we look at it from a concept perspective, all of a sudden we start to ask different questions and get different people involved. For example, if I want to achieve resiliency or that beneficial swarming during an incident, then the ways and the means I, as a leader, cultivate this prior to the incident becomes a big deal, right? So network leadership intentionally engages others in activities like horizon scanning to help stakeholders decouple false mental constructs and recognize strong and weak areas of change about the future. When it comes to DoD performing DISCA, then it's not just about knowledge of a disaster for that area. It's about anticipating what a possible future can be and then reminding those you're working with to stay nimble, flexible, adaptable. Basically, your leadership strength to deal with uncertainty is what provides your civilian counterparts the mental space they need to change their thinking and behaving before a disaster occurs. During the disaster, instead of just focusing on command and control, your job becomes anticipating the next big need and starting to align resources. Using anticipatory leadership approaches, you're to consider those second and third order effects. follow-on disasters that occur after the flooding and the hurricanes, things like riots, looting, safety and provision for responders. I think in a lot of ways we do this already, but the one area that DoD is better at addressing and teaching their civilian counterparts is how to effectively act when a disaster has disenfranchised their community. Meaning, when others are cut off, how do they lead themselves and small teams towards something greater or towards a bigger whole? So during the planning process, are you bringing this up? Are you suggesting what success could be in this condition? Here, we in the military know we are to do this before we go into battle, but we've never thought of applying this in our homeland. Why not? This is something that we're inherently really good at doing. Next, immediately following the crisis period, DoD often looks to diminish their involvement. And perhaps when it comes to our assets, that should be the case. Yet there's a part of me that during that COVID-19 disaster, I believe our talents and strengths could have come shining through if we were able to lead and guide Tiger teams as a problem-solving technique. This is something that we do all the time. And instead of just letting civilians lead and we're sort of like joining their efforts, this might be the most appropriate place where a handoff takes place, right? So what might it look like? Well, those in the defense coordination element may now have a broader role. They help to identify what kind of Tiger teams you need, who would be the members of those Tiger teams. They would lead discussions to help shape the problem and then lead discussions to help shape the solution, right? Using synergistic leadership, DoD can decide then that their primary role might be to be the leader to the leader in private. So then you can help them identify and mitigate and harness external forces and regain stakeholder community based on a vision of success or based on desired strategic end state. Okay. And as part of the disaster response, when society is at an in-between state, kind of where we are right now with the COVID, where we're sort of done with the disaster and the future is possible, DoD can come in and help their counterparts realize that there is a future beyond what's occurring using sense-making techniques. Instead of going back to normal or finding a new normal, our DISCA engagement may be to remind our civilian counterparts of the work we did pre-disaster, right? So pre-disaster, we might have identified future transportation models, smart cities being developed. Such reminders help local leaders avoid opportunism and help the community transition towards value-centered living where everybody's engaged in their future. See, everyone in the trenches is going to be tired at this point, but when you come in, you do a little backcasting with them and then a little bit of forecasting to help them move into the future, you help get away from that disaster fatigue, the compassion fatigue that usually goes on, all right? So the implication again for DoD is you stay engaged from a sense-making standpoint. You strengthen interdependent community groups to help meet future demands, and then you remind them of their proposed future based on the previous efforts. So again, when we're looking at a dynamic disaster response system, this is what it could look like. It starts to get all involving. However, we as DoD need to go back and ask ourselves again, what is it we want? If our desired end state is to be involved less or not involved as much, so that we can defend our nation, then we need to inherently build that into the system response. The next question becomes, what is it that we possess in abundance? We always have command and control of the assets that we have. In essence, we have leadership. And yet, I wonder if we're really bringing that forward when we have a mindset that every disaster is a local disaster. In a lot of ways, we're waiting for the local officials to do the leading, when in reality, many of them have the least amount of experience during the disaster to do this, all right? Now, there's definite strategic implications. I need my slide to advance. Oh, it went too far. There are definite strategic implications anytime you're talking about a whole system change, right? There definitely, you know, in DoD, one of the best things that we've ever done is we have the basic model of strategy. Desired end state means that you have to back and figure out your ways and means of getting there. And if we're looking at a system response now, that means that there's a bit of a mindset shift, a disaster definition change, an organizational redesign, and also a comprehensive strategy shift that goes on. And there's always risks and opportunities to this, right? There's always a strong desire for people to go back to the way it was. We know that when there's a lack of healing, there's stagnant societal growth that takes place later. We know that disasters fatigue people. And we also now have talked about what happens when there's no vision, right? When there's no success, you can almost never declare victory, and you have a disaster that just languishes and goes on and goes on and goes on. But on the opportunity side of things, right, characterization creates clarity. We know from research that the more you elongate your response time, that actually changes decision-making processes and reduces second and third order effects. Model changes enable force multipliers, and citizens start to take ownership and start making sense of the community overall. Again, disasters are disruptors, and they require change agent leaders. So now DISCA, using a system dynamics model, means that there has to be a mindset shift for us, challenging how and when we get involved. Organizational redesign means DoD gets involved early, providing deliberate leadership. And we get to re-envision a comprehensive strategy that goes beyond engaging DoD assets when we provide leadership as an offering. How do we do it? Well, you know, Gavin could have her own opinions all day long, but, you know, it always works out so much better when you do it as a group. So when you create our new vision of success for defense support to civil authorities, we start to have greater awareness. We start to translate those visions into desired end state definitions, and then we reimagine a new architecture that would support those desired end states. Does that mean we have to revamp everything we've created within the National Guard Bureau or all our Title X forces? No, it doesn't. But you would do an analysis here, right, where a slight change in architecture does mean how we engage becomes a little bit different. And so you want to optimize the community's efforts by identifying and prioritizing these strategic initiatives. And then, of course, you publish a roadmap and you implement your findings. Again, this is a very broad strokes way of looking at things. And I realize what I'm doing is proposing something completely new to folks. But, you know, what I would love to do at this point in time is either, John, I don't know, I saw a lot of people sending in chats along the way. We could either address those, or I can pose questions to the audience that they would respond to. So what are you seeing on your end?
Well, I have 6 or 7 questions that some I took out of the chat and some that were posted up in the Q&A that maybe we could go through first, and then if there is time still left, we can do a Q&A, flip it around and let you do the questions.
Okay.
Okay. So the first
Yep.
question came from, here we go, from David Lohman, and he's asking, what year did FEMA do these predictions? And he's referring to the predictions that you spoke about on slide 4, the FEMA future predicted disasters. He's just asking what year FEMA created that list.
So this is pretty funny. What I thought as a futurist, they did it in 2011, and I believe their future forecasting efforts kind of went on through 2014, and then I didn't see anything after that. But I thought that this was pretty incredible. So yeah, they were predicting this in 2011.
Wow. Okay. All right. Go to the next question. So question is, when responding to disaster as a group of decentralized cells, what would be your recommendation to ensure those cells can operate effectively and not end up cut off? As in, how do we keep them supplied, in communication, etc.?
Oh, wow. So I think you're totally getting at the point about the issue of being decentralized, right? And this is something we don't inherently plan for. You can tell that when we're having a disaster effort, we kind of pretend we always have communication or we're always connected with other people, and that we know exactly what our game plan is supposed to be. And yet that's not really reality, right? Like we look at incidents like hurricanes and flooding, and then you see these good citizens come together and they might try to do individual works. And so what I'm trying to suggest is, why don't we be very intentional about preparing our citizens and ad hoc leaders through the community to know how to lead under these conditions, right? So they may only have one bit of information that helps them know how to become a whole, because you're right, the communication could be cut off or cut off where they are, but they would already have like a standing order, so to speak. So one type of example is, Home Depot and Lowe's. They're so accustomed to supporting Florida or other areas where there is a big disaster that goes on, that they logistically move all their assets in one area and then even time it out in terms of when they bring these things in. So they kind of already have a standing order in place regarding how they will act. Well, I'm kind of suggesting that we should be building this into our communities, and maybe it's something we do through natural community leaders, right? I've seen GDIT stand up quite a bit of effort to empower its people to think about disasters early. So it's kind of doing something like that, but going a step further.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question from Elizabeth Mezekapa. Are there scenarios where the traditional models are preferable to the new model? For example, the Boston Marathon was a time and space limited event. Other events have different contours.
Oh, yes. No, I love it. So you're right. Now, we've been using this traditional model in a lot of different ways, right, already. We use the model for hurricanes, which are a little bit longer than an initial event. We've used the model for, like you're bringing up, the Boston Marathon, one bombing day incident that progressed very actively over a 5-day period. But what I would love to see again is to push the boundaries. If we always tell ourselves that a disaster is a very specific time and place incident, then I really think we're bounding ourselves about what the real needs are, or when we make decisions, or how we make decisions. And let me give you an example. Here, none of us knew how bad the pandemic was going to be. right? We knew that it was occurring. If you weren't in healthcare specifically, you were not thinking about patient counts and so forth. And there were so many things we didn't know back in March of 2020. Well, if you sat there and you started to think, well, I'm just going to think that this is a one-time event or a one-time in space event, or it's only going to last 2 weeks or 6 weeks, is where we started to get into this trouble, because we bounded our thinking and our perspective about where to go. So my desire would be that we create a dynamic disaster response model, again, where we're getting away from the linearness of things, so that people start to see how systems impact each other and how we can more effectively move through a disaster, and then also, what do I want to say, like hit this redesign at the end. Of course, you can't make all change at once, but that would be my preference, only because we've been using the traditional model for so long. But I'm open to conversation. If somebody thinks that there's a definite application point for this, I would love to hear some feedback on that.
Okay, sounds good. Move on to the next question, also by Elizabeth Mezzacava. Are you worried about the optics of a DoD entity intervening in a local civil response? For example, an uprising type event?
Oh, wow. So, you know, no, I'm not really worried about that, but I do think it has to be done appropriately, where, you know, what we've seen, as a matter of fact, there was a few articles that I was pulling up about the border crisis from a couple of years ago, and how did that work? If DoD had just come in and thrown down a heavy hand and said, hey, I'm going to protect the border, that wouldn't have worked out too well. Probably for a lot of reasons, it wouldn't have worked out too well. So again, like engaging a group of folks who are owning entities, right? Owning entities that are there to solve pieces and parts of the problem always works out better, because DoD doesn't own the whole problem, right? So, so maybe just personally, I'm not dissuaded by optics, but I am dissuaded about overly taking ownership about things that belong to other entities. We have a lot of great law enforcement out there that each have their respective strengths and functions, and you want them to come together. So that's the other reason why I'm always presenting more of a leadership focus about figuring out, how do I do that? How do I integrate more effectively? We share functional similarities, but we do still have our own equities, and that's the part that has to be, you know, developed together. So.
Okay, the next two questions are somewhat related, so I think I'll toss them up there. I'll toss both up there. So the first one is, what role will the National Guard Bureau play in the proposed rules of engagement change in response to a national emergency? And the second one is also, based on the model, who would take the lead, the DoD reserve component or the active duty component? And both these questions were submitted by Al Brzezinski.
Oh, that's an interesting. Can you flip to the first question for me so I can read that one again?
Yes, let me. New question. Give me one second here. Okay, here's the first one, I think.
The role of the National Guard. So, you know, we always have this, in terms of the National Guard, right? They are our most flexible asset, because they can be stood up either through their state, they could be federalized but still under state control under Title 32, or they can be totally federalized under Title 10 and be an active response component. So, you know, I always believe that the Guard should be involved, especially because they have so much more connection to their community. But, you know, I do think that a lot of times the Guard goes unaddressed, right? A lot of folks now are trying to look at what is the right application of the Guard in other kinds of disasters, agricultural disasters, emergency grid disasters, you know, and then of course there's the inherent problem of overtasking the National Guard, right? They're only one set of players, and now you're engaging them in multiple ways. So the question about the Guard playing for the rules of engagement, you're right. Some of these things are already working for them, but I do think there needs to be greater depth about these rules of engagement and greater preparation. One of the things I'm seeing in disaster scenarios, I mean, I realize the federal government doesn't do the 9 planning disaster scenarios anymore as its static way of preparation. However, at the same time, what we have done in our disaster preparedness when we use scenarios is one of two things, right? We either give our participants a scenario where we have made it the worst case type of event and all the wheels fall off and everything falls apart, or we have people work a scenario that's so very contained, and then we try to see what right looks like. Now, I'm not saying doing either of those things are wrong, but what I would love to see in the future, and we could use the National Guard as one example, is where you then recraft those scenarios under different conditions where certain things work out for you and then other things don't. And then likewise, again, a fourth scenario where different things work out for you and different things don't. When you do it that way, when you kind of use the same scenario broken down into 4 views of it, you will inherently get more data out of your capability. And what you can do is what they call a strategy challenge. So if you thought the National Guard strategically was supposed to be used for X, and now you see how that plays out in those 4 variations of the same scenario, you might start to realize, I don't think our rules of engagement were working very well in 3 of those 4 scenarios, and yet that was our basic way of going about business. So that's what I'd like to see for the future. So I realize, Al, I didn't quite answer your question, but what I'm trying to do is propose a way that we would figure it out together, right?
Okay, well, we only have about a minute left on our allotted time slot, so we do have 2 more questions. See if we can get to these. At what level of disaster do you propose DoD engaging? Every incident, or once state? Every incident, or once state determines that they have exceeded their capacity. Submitted by David Maher.
I would love to see a more integrated approach from the get-go, at least on some level, right? And what I'm proposing is on more of a leadership level, a more decision-making level. Again, if folks like in the defense coordinating elements were engaged with their local or regional counterparts early during the COVID, this could have really helped them understand what was going, and they could have been there to shape. Again, shaping the problem or framing the problem is a particular skill set, right? And then, of course, shaping your solution or shaping your options. So what I'm proposing is not necessarily a heavy asset involvement. I'm suggesting that DoD entities be engaged with their local folks much earlier in all disasters so that they understand or help their local leaders and be a support. In some cases, it might just be, hey, my buddy's there, right? That's what we experienced during the Boston bombing. I didn't have to get to know you. I already knew you when you were standing next to me. The mayor and the governor didn't have to figure it out. The governor showed up. So it's that kind of arrangement where you've really broken down these obstacles that keep us from doing things together. And of course, you need trust with it. So, next question.
I think we're a little over time, but I think we can do the next one maybe,
Okay.
because I do know you're familiar with this. For those not familiar with the Tiger Team term, can you maybe give an example, like the Apollo 13 example, and benefit of Tiger Teams everywhere, submitted by Mark Dodge.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark, for bringing up Apollo 13. That is the perfect example of what a Tiger Team does, right? So you're in a situation, you're not even sure how to frame it. You do know that certain people need to be involved, but you also have to stay nimble and flexible. So for example, it might come down to a type of disaster such as banking, right? Banking or financial. And so you certainly would need financial folks there, but you'd also need to have other folks as part of it too. And the idea again is that the Tiger Team helps you not only frame the problem, but then talk about options for the solution. Too many times we rush to a one solution state, and then we start going down a particular path, and we're nervous, or we just haven't tried to consider what are my options. You know, oftentimes it's more than two options, right? It could be 3 or 4, and you challenge yourself, and that's what the Tiger Team does for you.
Great. So we only have one more question, so I think we can try to knock it out. What impact does citizen preparedness have on overall outcomes? Do investments in citizen readiness, such as food, water, medical supplies, and training, civilian defense, newsletters, etc., have a significant impact, or is it all on the government? Submitted by Arnold Packman.
So interestingly, in Australia, there was some research that came out of this. And so, yes, there is a very positive impact when you engage your citizens to be prepared. But it also has to do with a little bit more than that, right? I mean, certainly having individuals get their own food and water and medical supplies together is a great way of going about things, and then they could wind up becoming the ad hoc leaders in certain communities and so forth, which is what you want. Like, you want to elongate what they call the Good Samaritan period. In every disaster early on, often citizens are very willing to help their neighbor, help each other, and that's called the Good Samaritan period. And leaders can do things to either foster that period or season of time, or they could do things to cut it off. And usually the biggest issue has to do with resources. So as resources become more constrained, people become more self-focused, right? Which makes sense, because I want to survive and I'm going to care more about me or my family than the stranger on the street. So again, it does come down to citizen preparedness. And again, the more initiatives that are out there about how citizens become prepared or how they function as a community is going to go well for you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gavin. That does conclude. That's all the questions that we have. I was tracking many in the chat. We are a little bit over time, so I do apologize to people for that. But it looks like most people hung on and listened to what was being said, so that is good news. Obviously, it sparked some interest for a lot of folks. But again, very big thank you for Dr. Cynthia Gavin, putting together this presentation and devoting a lot of time and energy to this. And thank you to all the attendees for your time and interest. Please, if you want to share this out, it will be posted on the HDIAC website as soon as it's ready, and we will post it up on YouTube so that the community can review it later. But again, thank you very much, and I will talk to you later.
Right. Thank you, John, and everyone who's participated. Appreciate it.
Right.